I am Christophe Difo, and we're going to see how this goes, and I'm looking forward to the chat.
And I'm Sean Prophet, and this is our first go round at a sort of a new show format that we're planning to do in the age of coronavirus, where we can talk to each other online and discuss some of these ideas, particularly having to do with race, culture, and religion. That seems, and the law, of course. Those are our major topics. So
I like that, Sean. I like that.
Welcome to the show, everybody. So, Christophe, what do you think about this whole situation with the firing of the New York U.S. attorney?
Sure. I think, and we were talking a little bit about this earlier. I mean, this is, I think, just another one of the planks of, in the sort of edifice of fashion, of authoritarianism, right? I mean, this is authoritarianism 101. We don't even have to look to the far past to see this. I mean, we can look at Turkey. We can look at Brazil. We can look at all these places and see the Philippines, right? I mean, this is not new, right? This is what happened.
Attack the media, attack the courts, attack elections, accuse your opponents.
Silence opponents, and get everyone on and like you've said this before, get everyone on the take, right? So that everyone below you is anyone that might be able to confront you, anyone who might be able to hold you to account, is that the goal is to corrupt them, right? So that they are now part of your system, and now you've created an incentive where they have little incentive to question what you're doing, because now they are on the take also, right? So if it's an indictment of them if they confront you.
Yeah, you expand the gravy train to the point where people's careers, people's political careers, and financial careers are dependent on the loyalty aspect.
Exactly. And loyalty, that's the key right there, right? That's the key. And I mean, and Trump makes no bones about this, right? Like, I mean, it's not like it's pretend. It's not like he's like sneaking around. I mean, it's happening like it's a slow motion car wreck happening right in front of our eyes. I mean, everyone knows that this man is about loyalty. And so getting back to, I think, to the particular situation here, right? I mean, and you mentioned this earlier, that we're talking about a Trump appointee here.
Berman is a Trump appointee who was sent in to kind of clean up the mess that Trump was facing with Preet Bharara, who was his predecessor, who was being very aggressive towards enforcing the law and towards a lot of Trump cronies. And so they brought in Berman, and now he's doing his job, and he's being accused and removed for being too aggressive at enforcing the law, which is his job. Yeah,
absolutely. And this is interesting. I just thought about this now, but the great, like, one of the values of having we can talk a lot about the value of lifetime appointments for judgeships, but one of the reasons why there's value there, and we talk about this a lot in law school, right, is that, right, because we're talking about the Supreme Court rulings that came out this week. One of them was purely procedural, right, and that was the DACA one. And so they basically, in opinion, laid out the framework by which the administration could do it right. So, like, we bought ourselves some time, but that's all that's happened, right? We just bought ourselves.
I still think that with the DACA ruling, that I think John Roberts is he's no dummy, and he's putting Trump on notice that we're not going to rubber stamp you anymore. And I think that it may be more than procedural. It's hard to tell, but it's like what I think is going on is that the DACA recipients who are here in this country have a constituency of their own. They're enrolled in universities, they have jobs, employers have spent money training them, all of those things. And so the Supreme Court is understanding that, because the Supreme Court, people think they're just this legal body, but they're actually very responsive to politics and culture. And they're looking at it, in the same way that with the other decision about LGBT employment law, right?
And that was the big one.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's like with the,
and not that DACA was small, but.
Well, it's huge. And I think that you get to a point where no matter how ideological the court becomes, unless they're just total cronies, unless they were all like Kavanaugh and Clarence Thomas, basically, and Alito.
Right.
You had those three clones as all 9 justices. you might start to see some real hardcore rulings, that would be fascist. But the rest of them are still sane enough to look at the consequences of that such a ruling would have.
Absolutely, and this is, I think this is really important, and I think that in the public imagination, Supreme Court justices are liberal, they're conservative, and they're like sort of right, like they will always rule X on this way, they'll always rule that way. But at the end of the day, these are jurists, right? And they are among the smartest people. They are the smartest people in the law, right? Whether or not I agree with them, right? I mean, like think about Scalia, right? I disagree with almost every word that man wrote, but he was also brilliant, and that's just true, right? So these are not hacks. Now, whether or not you want to make that argument with like Kavanaugh or et cetera, like that's a different question. But like some of the judges that have been on before, and like, so what I think is fascinating is that a guy like John Roberts, a person who I believe was on the federal circuit in DC, which is like probably the most respected circuit, maybe next to like the Second Circuit, right? So this guy takes his job seriously, right? And so he is looking at the cultural landscape, et cetera. But he also doesn't want to come off as a hack. I mean, this guy, I think, is thinking about his legacy, right? He's thinking about what he looks like. And by the way, he's probably taking the fact that he is the Chief Justice. He's probably taking that kind of seriously. Like maybe I should not let this institution fall apart under me,
Right. Well, and what you were, to your point before that you were saying about, whether it's Clarence Thomas or Scalia or the people who are the textualist originalists, right?
Sure.
They are extremely good at justifying with good reasoning, what those texts meant when they were written, right? And, a lot of times they're self-serving interpretations, right? Because they're not acknowledging the fact that when those texts were written, a lot of the problems that we're facing today didn't exist. They weren't even conceived of. So, you can't,
right.
It's hard to be an honest textual originalist.
Absolutely. I mean, I think, and we recently talked about that book, The Reactionary Mind, right? And I can see that in these, when I was in law school and reading a lot of cases all the time, right? Like these old cases, and especially from Scalia, because you read a lot of those in law school. I didn't fully sort of grasp I didn't understand the sort of reactionary mind, conservative concept, but and for those who are watching, basically the idea is that conservatism is essentially an exercise in justifying power almost retroactively, right? It's a reactive sort of philosophy, not even
specifically the existing hierarchy that holds, like during the founding of the country. It was all based on property ownership and being white. So at that time, that was the top of the hierarchy. So the law was written entirely. It excluded women. It excluded, slaves were counted for representation purposes, but they couldn't vote. So, the 3/5 compromise, all that stuff, right?
Sure.
But that hierarchy was just built into the Constitution. Still
absolutely.
Point. Even the idea of a republic versus a democracy is a justification of hierarchy, right?
Absolutely, and the sort of in the Electoral College, all that, the idea that like the masses, the mob, and anyone who is not white and powerful and well born, right, just lacks the capacity to sort of speak for themselves, right? They cannot be trusted to speak for themselves, and so the reactionary.
The trusting is key because if you trusted the people to actually make decisions, then you wouldn't need to appoint representatives who could overrule the people, which is basically what senators, senators, by the way, who were appointed in the beginning, they weren't even elected.
Exactly.
And then electors who are essentially appointed based on who votes in their state for the presidential candidate. These are people who at many points now they're considered to be bound to honor the popular vote in their state. But there's even a Supreme Court case about that, whether they're going to allow these electors to sort of overrule the people. That a conservative ruling in favor of that would be ruling in favor of hierarchy. Like these people are special; they can overrule the masses, like you were talking.
Absolutely. And this sort of gets to the nub of the fundamentals of conservatism. And I just want to close the loop on the Supreme Court, and that is, right, when reading these sort of textualist interpretations, first of all, the idea that they're not activist judges is fucking bullshit. Like, of course they're activist judges. They are as activists as they come. I mean, right? The Second Amendment is like Scalia's interpretation of the Second Amendment is the classic example of that. I mean, it is as activist as you come. It's like, and again, basically conservative brilliance, it seems, certainly on the court, is the way, its ability to, as you say, sort of justify the reactionary, like being brilliant at like crafting ways to justify reaction to progress, like reactiveness to progress. Like that's it.
It's very similar to the whole concept of states' rights, right? Like, I mean, states' rights, activist judges, all of those things that the conservatives are absolutely, like you can't talk to them for 5 minutes without hearing, states' rights and activist judges, right?
Exactly.
So, but when it comes time when a state wants to do something that they don't like, then they just ignore, they forget anything about states' rights. And the same thing
drives me.
The same thing, like they would never consider, they would never admit for a second that Clarence Thomas was or Scalia were activist judges. But in fact, they are activists in the sense of that they are committed to the premise of reinforcing the hierarchy.
Exactly. They're as activist as any other liberal judge, like activist as hell. And this gets into, right, how and this is also in the reactionary mind, right, how conservatives co-opt liberal strategies, right, for their
Saul Alinsky is the Bible now in right-wing activism, and the left has forgotten all about it.
I mean, and here we are. I mean, it's just like this ironic circle. And back to the states' rights thing for a second, is my favorite is that you have, so let's say, we are in North Carolina and Raleigh, North Carolina decides that, look, we want, because, cities are bastions of liberalism, even in the South, relatively speaking. So let's say they say like, hey, look, we want to raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour here in Raleigh, right? We're like, we can't speak for the rest of North Carolina after all. Like, we're just a city.
Right, for our businesses in our city, we're going to do this.
We're going to do this, right? And so what conservative legislators have done in states like that is that they have preempted those states' laws. So they write those city laws. So they write state laws that say no city can raise the minimum wage to $15. So now your states' rights argument falls apart right there, right? Because the states' rights argument, the states' rights argument is that like local people should make their own laws, right? Like that's the states' rights argument, not someone over there in the but it all falls apart. But when it comes to a liberal city, no, don't let them make their rules. We get to make those. Again, we don't have to talk about.
I have a name for this.
On the right.
I have a name for this. It's called jurisdictional arbitrage, right? Wherever you're in power, that's the jurisdiction you favor at that time.
Exactly.
So, if you're in power in the city, you favor the city. You're in power in the state, favor the state. If you're in power federal, you favor the federal. And if the opposition is in power, then you're against it. And they play this game over and over and over and over again at every level.
On every level, and it's just like there's a bottomless pit of bad faith, and the right and on the left, one of our greatest failing on the left and the people in power, especially through the 90s and the early 2000s, was this idea that we were playing the same game, like that we were playing the same game as the
fair play.
That fair play, right? We're all playing by the same rules. That assumption killed us. And we now know that we are in a knife fight in a fucking phone booth. Like that is what we are for democracy, for literally for democracy.
Oh yeah, right now. And this situation that's going on, I mean, it's as serious as a heart attack. I mean, Berman was someone who had,
perfect.
He's going after Giuliani. He's going after all these associates of Trump, and a lot of harmful information can come out of that. And they're trying to set it up for the campaign right now. They don't want that. They don't want anybody under indictment. They don't want, harmful information coming out right now. Especially, I mean, you've got Bolton's book, which, by the way, I thought it was hilarious that he did not get his, that Trump did not get his preliminary injunction about the book.
Yeah, so I was like, yes, finally, thank God. Like what? I mean,
a little late. CNN, all the media, everybody had the book already, so it's kind of
yeah, exactly. So whatever. Like, everyone, all those people already read the book, or they've had their staffers read the book and they've read the summaries already, right?
Well, the funniest part about it is also, because he's claiming the book is at the same time it's all lies, but then it's classified. You can't have a classified lie. How do you do that?
What is it or is it not, right?
But this is interesting because we've just pointed out, we've pointed out now about 5 examples of hypocrisy. The textualism versus judicial activism, the
Right.
states' rights issue. Now we're talking about the ability to classify information. It's it just goes on and on and on and on.
On and on and on. And like, how about the email server, right? Like, I think there was like a lot of people in the sort of Trump circle were at, like, this was I don't know, like however many news cycles ago, and one of these things that would have been a scandal under normal circumstances, but just because there's a scandal every fucking week, it's just like, okay, well, but I think it was Ivanka Trump. She was using a private email server, and it's just like,
they're all using private. Trump uses his own cell phone. He doesn't even use a government protected cell phone. So basically his conversations, everything he does, it's an open book to all of our adversaries in the world.
It's just unbelievable. And again, like, but her emails, right? Like, but her emails, like, what?
They seize on one little thing, like they seize on things that aren't even really an issue, that just shouldn't be an issue at all, or they should at the very least be a bipartisan issue. Like, how can we make our government more secure? All right.
Exactly.
And then, and then it's like, well, okay, Hillary Clinton used this private email server. Well, what are we going to do to prevent that from happening in the future? Nothing, because as soon as the new administration comes in, Ivanka's doing it, Jared's doing it, they're all doing it.
Right.
Even, I think during the impeachment hearings, there was examples of all sorts of people using their own phones.
Yes.
Open
that's probably what I'm thinking.
Yeah,
that's what I'm thinking about, because I remember it being a long time ago, but I remember like this coming up and it not even being news, and just like, are you serious? I mean, come on, we had a whole election based on this idea. We lost an election based on this. And seriously,
not to mention any of the accusations of cronyism and nepotism and all of the emoluments, things.
Absolutely,
like, just goes on and on. Like
on and on.
This is the most corrupt administration that has ever existed in the United States.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, it has to be. And the sort of plain sight of it is what's so appalling, and perhaps why it's so, I always used to say, like, if you want to get away with something, do it in like absolute plain sight, right? Because no one's looking in plain sight. Like, and I mean, just act like you're doing nothing. Right? Just act like you're just doing what you would everyone is doing, and you can get away with it. And that's almost what this administration has been, right? Like Nixon was, like they go out of their way to hide it, to, cover ups, And maybe there are cover ups going on. I'm sure there are to some extent. But
you recall when Trump got on TV and literally just admitted flat out that there was a quid pro quo, right? He just admitted it
straight up.
And then later on they were like walking back saying, no, that didn't happen. But it's they literally at every point in this, they admit exactly what they're doing. Even when Trump said, hey, if we let everybody vote, Republicans would never win again. I mean,
he's like,
say the quiet part out loud,
You can't say that out loud. You're not supposed to say that part out loud, right? I mean, you're not supposed to say that part out loud. Unreal.
Yeah. So it's hard to say what's, I don't know like where this ends, right? Like how do the Democrats ever get, back control of anything? Because, we can't have a decent trial if the judges are corrupted. You can't impeach somebody if the Senate's corrupt. You can't, no part of our system of laws is really working right now.
Yeah, and that's right, and that's what's, I think, terrifying, and I think this is what goes under the radar with some of the both sides folks who obviously drive me up the wall. But this idea that like, oh, they're all a bunch of bums, right? Like the Democrats, Republicans are all a bunch of bums. So, but really, they're like, and maybe they are, but they're.
No, that's the laziest. That is the laziest interpretation of facts right now. It's the easiest thing in the world to say, and it means that you don't have to engage with any issue. You don't have to actually look at what's happening. You don't have to, you don't have to even read the news. You don't have to keep up on anything. It's just
exactly
at any point in history, if you want to say, oh, both sides are the same. Or both sides are at fault. That just gets you off the hook. It puts you sort of above it all. It gives you less of an incentive to vote, less of an incentive to be engaged, and less of an incentive to even examine your own ethics, right? Because you're kind of separating yourself from the fray.
And I think that's the rub, the last piece that you just said there. I mean, like all of what you said is true, but I think like what you just said at the end there was the rub, and that is not having to examine oneself, one's own ethics, how one operates in the world, how one benefits from privilege, how one, hurts other people without thinking and without caring. Like these are the things that people, and this is a both sides problem actually, but it's way worse on the right. And that is that folks unwilling to ask themselves those hard questions, right? Like we've talked about this a lot in terms of, living in an examined life, whatever you want to call it, developing a philosophy of life, right? Like investigating oneself, I think is something that people would much rather not have to do. And just saying they're all a bunch of bums is one of the easiest ways to get yourself off the hook. One of the easiest ways to get.
Yeah, and what you're saying is, like, to your point, a committed conservative, right? Forget traditional versus Trump conservatives. Okay, whatever flavor you are, if you've committed yourself to this premise that the powerful should rule, that that it's okay to take bribes, whatever the thing is, that you're not really serving the public, that you're serving yourself and your cronies, in government. If you've taken that position, at least you're honest about it, right? You're not going to sit there and say, you're honest with yourself. A lot of these guys, they know what the game is. They understand that, that they've signed on to a power proposition rather than a democratic proposition. And that's where they stand. And then you've got liberals, who think that, there actually should be public service, there should be justice, that there should be equality, that the powerful should have to account for themselves and all those things. Right. So both those people are pretty committed to their premises, and they've thought them through. But then you've got this giant area in the middle of,
that's most people.
The independents, or the people who just don't follow politics, or they, or whatever. And those are the people who, that's why this argument becomes so dangerous, because it allows these people to kind of like not be in either camp, and through their inaction, they actually help the conservatives, because it's much easier to break the system. It's much easier to corrupt the system than it is to establish accountability. Accountability requires controlling thousands of moving parts. It requires, making sure that, that nobody is corrupted, and that, that system is only as strong as the weakest link, right? If you've got, one person in the chain who's corrupted, they can start protecting other people in the chain who are corrupted. It just goes on and on and on. So in order for liberals to win and have a government based on public service and accountability, they have to win every day with everyone. Whereas conservatives just monkey wrench, one position at a time, one office at a time. I think that it's both sides always favors the oppressor and never
absolutely
justice.
100%. And that is so critical, right? Because it is the silence, right? Silence like benefits the oppressor. That's another one of those sort of cliches that flies around, right? Like silence is complicity, right? Like all these sort of things, and I'm glad to see people starting to get off the bench with this George Floyd and the sort of ensuing several weeks. People that are typically on the bench, even people who are, relatively liberal, right, lean liberal, but are just basically most of the time checked out, because it's a lot easier to just be checked out. You don't have to wrestle with the
conflict first, right? They don't want this battle. They don't like, everybody gets upset when they start seeing violence or people upset. It's like, we should all love each other. Well,
God, the love, oh my God, right? Oh, the wings, or the wing, the left and the right are the wings on the same bird, right? Like all that stuff. I mean, it's just like it's just, again, justification for that, for inaction, for like, oh no, all lives matter, right? Right. I mean, it's all that in that same ilk of, let's not address the issue, let's just ignore it. And again, it's steeped in privilege, because right? Because like by virtue of being in the middle of that sort of bell curve, right, it almost necessarily means that you don't have to worry about it, right? You're not at the margins, right? And so
And this is really what we have to start getting people to be concerned about is the rule of law. And it's a great segue from what we were talking about, because the whole reason everybody is in the street, and has been for several weeks, is because the rule of law failed.
Exactly.
It failed at the most basic level on the street with police who are supposed to be upholding the rule of law, and they did not follow their own rules, and they did not follow the laws of the land. So
exactly.
you saw this 9-minute horror film, snuff film basically of a cop snuffing out this man's life, and he's now become a global hero and martyr as a result of this. But the real problem is so much more widespread. This is just the tip of the iceberg with this whole thing.
It really is.
It is the breakdown of, again, with cops, of the rule of law, because, the structures of accountability that could prevent this, have been long ago quashed by the police unions, who really should only be negotiating on behalf of cops in terms of benefits, retirement plans, things like that. Instead, they've become basically a sort of quasi-legal advocate for police who are accused of wrongdoing and getting them reinstated. And
absolutely.
So it's a culture. It's a whole culture of it, and so we're seeing it whether it's at Supreme Court level, or whether it's at the level of New York. What'd you say? What's his actual title? What's Berman's title?
He is the Attorney General. No, he was just AUSA. He was an assistant U.S. attorney for Manhattan. Head attorney for head federal attorney in the borough of Manhattan.
Right. So he's been prevented from doing his job, by the Justice Department, who also, by the way, is in charge of all the regulations that that trickle down to police departments throughout the country.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly.
So this all actually lands at the Justice Department with William Barr, and then ultimately with President Trump, because Trump is essentially attacking and destroying the rule of law from top to bottom.
Absolutely, I'm just sort of I'm baffled, or I would be if I didn't know what all the things that we've talked about, and all the things that we both write about and talk about online. Just about human nature, right? I remember as a young person in high school, it was hard for me to wrap my mind around a lot of things, but not the least of which was how do a bunch of entire country, Germans, right? How does an entire country turn a blind eye? And how does an entire country get enveloped by fascism? Like, how does that happen? Like, it seems so baffling to me. But now it's obvious to me, right? Because people are conflict averse. So, just like you were saying earlier,
it's the core. Conflict aversion is the core of how fascism takes over a country.
That's the nub of it, right? That's the nub of it. Because if enough people are not willing to stand up and say, no, I'm not okay with this, or not willing to essentially be corrupted, right? We keep talking about corruption, right? Because it's all about corrupting one person, then corrupting another person, and then another, and that's how it spreads. And next thing you know, it only takes one fascist to corrupt an entire neighborhood, right? It only takes one fucking fascist to do the entire neighborhood, because then everyone's like, yeah, well, I don't want to say X, Y, and Z because of that person over there, the fascist over there. He's going to tell on me, right? So then I start now telling on people too, right? Because if I don't, and then next thing you know, you got an entire neighborhood and then an entire nation, right? Sort of enveloped in this cloud of suspicion and paranoia, and again, it's all about like, well, I don't want my family to get hurt. I don't want to lose my job. I don't want to go to the gulag either. Like, I get it. I don't want to go to the gulag either. But this is why it's important to nip fascism in the bud before we even get to that place, right? Because otherwise, people
also is that it would be one thing if everybody was really concerned about their families and families were together on this, but they're not. Families are many times really split on these issues. And you have Trumpism has driven a stake into American families. I mean, there are so many people who, they just can't even have Thanksgiving dinner, or, even pre-COVID, they couldn't have Thanksgiving dinner because of the toxic nature of, you get one fascist at the table, right? And now all of a sudden, everybody's having to figure out, do I confront this guy? Do I walk away? What do I do here? Do I, is this, and they often choose family harmony over ethics.
And that is so important. That's so important. It's so important. And this is why when people ask me, especially in the wake of all this stuff, right? And we should talk about talk about race a little bit more deeply later. But people have asked me I have most people I know are white, right? I mean, I grew up in that environment, right? So and they're generally progressives, right? I certainly don't have a lot of conservatives in my life. And so people ask me like, oh, what can I do? I mean, like, how can I be an activist? And read White Fragility, right? Read the books, right? Read How to Be an Anti-Racist. I think that's important. But I think the biggest thing, and maybe maybe this is like covered in the book, but it is that being willing to stand up and confront your family members. Like, I think that is like right. And it doesn't mean you have to have a knockdown, drag out fight, but it does mean that like, it's being like, no, actually, I am not going to be a safe space for your bigotry. Right. Like, no, like,
well, the problem with families is that a lot of these people on the right, they actually believe that they're ethical. They actually believe they have a whole series of justifications as to why they want to have ethnic nationalism, for example, or why whites are superior, or all these other horribly unscientific things. But if you believed all of those things, then they might have an ethical stance, right? I mean, I still I could argue all of those all the way on down the line, but still, you can figure that there's some point they could make a stand and say that they were actually not bigots and they were not evil and they were, that they had a right to hold that opinion, right? And that you should not, dismiss them. But in point of fact, justice is not subject to those arguments, right? I mean, you can't, if somebody is openly advocating for injustice,
right,
they have to back it up with things like white supremacy and scientific racism, the idea that eugenics, even going back to eugenics. This is where you get down to, and a lot of people aren't that sophisticated. They will just openly say and do racist things. The whole idea of he shouldn't have resisted. If you don't commit a crime, you don't have to worry about being shot. All of those justifications. They don't get far into the hardcore right wing Nazi stuff. But
sure.
But if anybody who is the more thoughtful a person was, the more intellectual a person was, the more when they start to go to the right wing, they start reading, all these books to justify their position. So now if you talk to that person, you're not even agreeing on the basic facts of humanity, right?
Exactly.
Multicultural societies don't work, and we shouldn't encourage them. We should separate the
right. It ends up becoming more refined, right? The further you go to the right, but the problem is that it necessarily, right? It always rests on the basic idea of a hierarchy. Always, right? Like, no matter how you try and spin it and justify it, right? One of the new favorites I heard, because the eugenics, or not, I'm sorry, not the eugenics, but the sort of genetic inferiority argument has been largely rejected and disposed of, and it's just so plainly and obviously racist that it's hard to make the argument. But unless you're just a flat out racist, but if you don't think of yourself as that way, so now the argument becomes Black culture is the problem, right? So it's not that Black people necessarily because then you can point to someone like, I don't know, Colin Powell, or that other guy who looks like I don't know, he's a colonel something, and he looks like a Black cop in every single movie, every single Black cop in every movie, and he's got the haircut. Anyway, I don't remember what his name is. I'll remember it for next time. Anyway, but you point to those guys, the guys that are just who just basically deny or do not really identify with Blackness very, very close in. Those are the Black people we want. But Black culture, is lazy. It's X, Y, and Z. But it always comes down to the same thing: this hierarchy that there needs to be people at the bottom who deserve to be there. And by the way, the police job is to make sure they stay there, right? That's a huge part of the police's job, right? And that is always what it comes down to. And it's always intellectually dishonest. But it's just a question of whether, it's a sophisticated a sort of intellectual dishonesty, or is it just like you say, just like unsophisticated, just blabbering, just racist ass things,
Right. And so here's the other point that I realized one day when I was talking to one of these people, and they were saying, oh, they're inferior. They haven't invented anything by themselves. They did, blah, blah, blah. This horrible shit. Right.
Sure.
It's absolutely, it's demonstrably false. Okay. But they believe it.
Obviously false. Yeah.
And I'm going, okay. Just for the sake of the argument, let's just say that there is something inferior about people of color. Okay.
Sure.
If that were true, wouldn't it argue for spending more resources and giving more help to those people, right? Because we have somebody who's handicapped, or somebody who's mentally challenged, right?
Exactly.
We give them special education, we give them special treatment, unless you're a fascist, and then you just put them in the oven, But
right, yeah, exactly. Yeah.
That's what it comes down to. Is you could take the same set of facts, if you could allow that there was a disparity between races, which isn't even a scientific concept.
Yeah,
but if you allow that, if you're a liberal or a Democrat who believes in justice, you would have to argue for more resources, not less, and better treatment, not worse.
Right. And this gets to the ethics argument, right? Because I'm like, let's assume that, again, we're assuming for the sake of argument here that people of color really are inferior, mentally or whatever, right? Culturally, whatever. So if that's the argument, then so is your argument that your argument is obviously don't give people more resources, right? Because you don't like affirmative action, right? You don't like welfare, even though welfare goes to more white people than black people, but whatever, right? You don't like any of these programs, right? Because you think they all go to black people. So my question to that conservative is, what is your argument? So what do you think we should do then? Is it that people should just die?
Here's the pivot. Die in the terms of deny them resources, deny them healthcare. Then the answer is yes, right?
The answer is yes, right? That is, and that's fascism. That's fascism, right? That's just a couple. That's just right. The ovens are just an extrapolation from that same concept, right? Basically, just get rid of them.
Neglect is the same as the oven, really.
Exactly.
When you look at widespread neglect, where millions of people don't have health care, millions of people don't go to the doctor when they should, all those things, that neglect kills them just as certainly as if you all rounded them up. It just takes longer,
It just takes longer. Right. I mean, right. I mean, and again, this gets the intellectual dishonesty that you have to engage in if you are going to try and maintain these positions on the right. And we can start talking about libertarianism as well, right?
Well, absolutely. We need to talk about libertarianism. We need to talk about libertarianism. But when this really first became evident to me, I mean, it started out, 2010 with the Tea Party. Okay. But really the 2012 debates, right? When, there was I forget what debate this was, but one of the moderators asked, what should happen? What should happen when, somebody doesn't have health care? Should we just let them die? And you hear multiple people in the audience calling out, yes, let them die, right? I have that recording. It used to be on the open to my old show, right? Was them going, let them die, right? And this is when fascism really came to America, is the moment when at a public debate, people were openly willing to declare that those without health care should be allowed to die.
Yeah.
And that's the really scary moment. And so that was only 8 years ago. But now we're to the point where, you start talking to these, the white supremacists, and they will say that there literally should be a segregation,
Yeah, absolutely.
And what they mean when they say that, they literally mean, having people live in separate countries,
absolutely.
Ethnic cleansing, in a way. I mean, how else do you accomplish it when you have a multicultural society like ours? It's already it's not like going to become it already is multicultural. So how do you get back to a white nationalist society? You have to deport or kill. Those are the only two options.
And absolutely. And I think that's an important fact, right? Because every time any large group of people gets moved, that means it is an atrocity, right? The Trail of Tears is the most obvious example, but like in modern history, but also, you know, during World War II, the Bataan Death March was another one where like a large group of American and Allied prisoners were moved, and I mean the percentage of death on that walk is astonishing. And again, and that's in wartime, but again. If you are talking about like ethnic nationalism and like deporting every person of color in America, I mean, like, how do you think that looks? And how do you think there's not going to be resistance to that? And right, and these people want that resistance in a lot of ways, right? Because then that justifies a lot.
Crackdowns, yeah, you know, crackdowns, killings, right. Whatever it is, and so it's just, yeah, it's. Ultimately, there's no way to get around the fact that if you don't take care of everyone, if you don't expand your, because to me, it's expanding the sense of culture, right? Like,
yes.
Who are we as Americans? And the white nationalists say it's whites, Christians, you know, whatever.
Sure.
Liberals say it's all of us, strong together. You know, every slogan, every part of the Democratic Party and liberalism says we must consider all Americans to be part of our family. We must take care of them like we are one family, you know, and that means that, you know, that some of the people who in the past were left out are now going to get preferences. And that's what brings you to affirmative action and all those things. Because it's like, how are we going to live together where we don't have these marginalized people who are living in their cars or on the street, you know, and one paycheck away from, you know, disaster.
Disaster.
How do you accomplish that? And the right-wing answer is, get rid of it. Get rid of the problem. You know? And the liberal answer is include everyone. And there's almost no way, like every discussion that takes place between right and left ultimately is referencing that divide.
Absolutely. And I'd like to sort of go back kind of a little bit to what we were talking about before, like, because we've been talking a lot about like fascists and right-wing nationalists and all that kind of stuff. But I want to hit on this because it's easy then for people watching this or people that we talk to online, you and I all the time, to say like, well, I'm not a Nazi, right? I'm not a fascist, right? And I'm on the right, but I'm not X, Y, and Z. And again, I think it's really important, I think, to highlight that, you know, like straight up fascism, as we think about it, is just an extrapolation of it is just like that. It's just a little bit more of an extreme version of the right in this country right now. And certainly there are the actual right and white nationalists and the paramilitary guys and all that kind of stuff right now. But even the people who call themselves, right, like sort of traditional conservatives, right, like if you take their reasoning to its logical conclusion, the answer is still the same, right? The answer still is that in 2012, the person at that debate said it out loud, but that was always true, right? Because the answer to no healthcare for everyone means people die unnecessarily while other people live in privilege. Like that is so again, I just want to hit that point that like even that sort of quote moderate Republicans or the libertarians, like it's still essentially a death cult, right? You're essentially saying like, no, you don't get this just because you're not us. That is the nub of the argument, the entire right. And again, this goes to that dichotomy that you're talking about.
There's a lie, and that is that you don't hear it so much anymore because, you know, people are either Trumpers or they're not, you know. But the lie used to be somebody who would say they were fiscally conservative and socially liberal.
Oh yes,
that is the biggest lie in the world. Because if you want a tax cut, if you're somebody who says I want to pay less taxes, what you're saying is that somehow the money that you would have paid in taxes is no longer going to be available, and a good portion of that money was spent to help people. Right. So, and everybody goes, you know, everybody wants to pay less taxes. I get it. You know, they think, okay, that's my money. You're taking my money.
Sure.
But what they also don't realize is that most of the tax cuts that have happened have gone to the very wealthy. Right.
Exactly.
Middle class tax rates have stayed very, very close in somewhere between a 15 and 30% rate forever. I mean, they really don't move. You know, and whereas you're super wealthy, you know, a lot of your income isn't, you know, you don't pay payroll taxes. You know, there's no Social Security from somebody who's a stock trader. So they're only paying capital gains, and usually long-term capital gains on their profits. So it's either 15 or 20% that they're paying on their income, whereas the middle class is paying somewhere around 30-ish.
Exactly.
So
with a lot less money.
Right. So the tax cutters cannot be socially liberal. Right.
Exactly.
They may be social liberal on saying things. I think you should be able to smoke pot. I think
it's always a classic example, right? Oh, I think no pot rule. Abortion, right? If you want an abortion, have an abortion.
Have an abortion. Get gay married.
Whatever.
Live with 3 different women. Whatever you want.
Whatever you want. Yeah. But don't take any of my money. And again, or my favorite, taxation is theft, which is just. That's one of the ones, man. That just gets me. It
gets the hell out of me too, and that gets you back to the libertarians who say, "Well, I never signed a social contract." Right. It's like, well, you drive on the road, don't you? And they're like, "Well, I pay gas taxes." What would I guess the only way to make this clear to libertarians is to turn everything into a user fee, right?
Right.
Into a user fee, and then maybe they would understand how that would work. But it's just more intellectual dishonesty that comes from this idea that somehow you can live in a civilization and have all of its protections and not have to pay for it.
Exactly. And it's always very, very telling that the libertarian, who is a libertarian, right? The libertarian is a white, young to middle-aged man. That is it, right? Relatively well off, right? Not wanting for much, right? That's always a libertarian, because a libertarian thinks that he doesn't need, and I say he because he's almost always a he, and he thinks he doesn't need social services at all. And so since he doesn't need them, no one else should need them. And it's always this intellectual dishonesty of packaged in, but don't worry, I think everyone should be able to smoke pot, so I'm actually not a bad guy, right?
Right. Well, and the underlying premise of that argument that you just absolutely cannot get away from is a misunderstanding of the concept of privilege, right? Because the white libertarian, right, has grown up with privilege. They've grown up bathed in public services that just kind of magically appeared that they can rely on the police to protect them. And they'll all oh, well, I can't count on the police, that takes them half an hour to get to my house, and meanwhile I've already been robbed. Well, how often have you been robbed? How often have you been robbed? It's the black people in the black neighborhoods who are getting robbed and where there's a lot of violence that really need the protection. They can't get it. The white person can get it, but they don't need it.
Yeah. It's so true. It's so true.
But so there's no way to separate this concept. And that is why a lot of white people react so strongly and violently to the concept of privilege, because it gives away, it collapses the entire libertarian game that says, I'm on my own, I don't need anybody. Once you recognize that comes from a place of privilege, and that your independence comes at a cost to society. You don't like seeing people sleeping on the street in their own filth? Well, then pay taxes.
Right. Exactly. That's just part of it. Right. And and the idea that a civilization can function without, taxes, without a government, there is no real argument for that. And and one of my favorites, I know it's not really fair, but it's one of my favorite ones. Like, oh, you want to be liberal? Go to Somalia. That's what happens when there's no government, right? Fiefdoms essentially appear, right? And with private armies. Yeah, right? That like mercenary army. That's what happens, right? So it's every dystopia, like every dystopic movie out there, right? Every end of the world scenario movie, that's what happens when there's no one overarching sort of power that can overpower everyone else.
Once you give up on a government with a military under civilian control, right? That's the key to everything. Sure. Having a government that controls the police force and the military separately, very separate. Sure. You can't have the military enforcing on internal enforcement, right? You don't want to have that.
Don't want that.
but it all requires that accountable control of the power. And
Absolutely.
that leads us right back to our discussion about the police forces again.
Yes. Now we can get back to the police forces, which I think is an important one.
So what do you think about defund the police as a slogan?
Wow. That, I think, I've had this is a great topic. And we've talked a little bit about it already, but I offline, my initial reaction to it. So I was at the only demonstration that I went to is here in Jersey City. I live in Jersey City, New Jersey. My wife and I and several of our friends, we went down there. Everyone was wearing masks. It was great demonstration. But one of the things that the woman was saying, and she was 18 years old up there, like she was one of the speakers, and she was absolutely phenomenal. It's a Black woman. She's going to, I think, Morehouse in the fall. Oh no, Howard in the fall. Brilliant woman. Anyway, she's up there. She's talking. She's like, defund the police, and she was like really in, and so like my initial reaction was just sort of like, man, like is that smart, right? Like, is that practical? But the more I thought about it, and I think you made this argument really well, and that is that, that the right is going to depict us as wanting to disband
radical left. Just want anarchy. We just want the streets just ablaze,
and especially want Black and Latino thugs walking around your neighborhood and raping your lily white daughters, right? Like that is like the image that they're trying to evoke, right? And that's classic tactic, right? This was like thousands of Black men were lynched on this exact premise, right? In the South and across this country. So if they're going to do that anyway, why not just say what we mean? And then we're going to have a public opinion war no matter what. Right, like so. Go ahead.
Yeah, so I think a couple things, and that is that I have literally had to wade through probably 6 of my white friends or friends of friends, taking issue with this idea that we shouldn't be saying defund the police because it's a problem, and and coming up then with alternative slogans that they think are better,
sure.
Reform or reframe or rebrand or whatever you want to call it. They have some other thing that is short of defunding the police, right?
Yeah.
And what I came to is I was thinking about the trajectory of the Black Lives Matter slogan, which when it first came out, created a huge reaction in everyone. White people, Black people were for it, obviously. White people were like, didn't quite know what to do with it. And then they came all lives matter, blue lives matter, all these retorts to it. And it started out, the public opinion survey on Black Lives Matter 5 years ago was like 10 or 15 points underwater, right? Sure. Most Americans didn't like the slogan, didn't agree with it, thought it was divisive and all these kind of things. It's now like plus 25 or plus 30. And the entire country, you look at the protests, mostly white faces are out there.
Absolutely. I'm
not saying, every Black person is out there, but there's a lot of white people out there.
Yeah.
And so you have the situation where now it's being painted on the streets of every American city, Black Lives Matter, in letters that you can see from space. Right?
It's amazing.
So it's amazing. And that's what happened to a slogan that started out 10 or 15 points underwater, because it became clear that was the essential truth of the situation, that Black lives didn't matter, that they needed to matter more, and all of that. So when you hear defund the police, it's like, yes, we have to explain it. But what I was saying to my white friends about this, I'm going, look, guys, this was invented by the Black Lives Matter movement. They came up with the slogan. They started using it, and now all of a sudden everyone is saying it, right? And now you're going to come along and say, oh, we should have had a focus group. Oh, we should have figured this out. We need to get a marketing guy in here. Let's get a marketing guy in here to figure out what the best slogan is. It's like, no, this is the slogan. This is the one that resonates, and it resonates because it pisses off the right wing. All right?
Exactly.
If you're going to already deal with this trope that you're talking about the thuggish person of color, you're already dealing with that. That's already out there. And it's going to be already used against us, but from top to bottom of the right wing, snarlocracy, whatever. The insanosphere, whatever you want to call it. They're already saying all those things, right? So it is best strategy wise for us to embrace it, because it will be used against us anyway.
Exactly. And I think you also brought up a really great point the other day, and I sort of piggybacked on a post or I think it was in response to a white, progressive white person, whose concern, had these concerns. And without directly accusing her of white splaining, because I don't think that's where she was coming from, but but that it really smacks of
I
that,
use
right?
that word.
Right. So right, because so it's like, wait, so you're like, all right, so the Black Lives Matter people are in their office, wherever the hell their office is, and they're like, do you think they didn't think about that? You know what I mean? Like, do you really think they were like, I'm not, again, they probably didn't, focus group it and have marketing people in. Maybe they did, but whatever. But the point is, a bunch of people that had been running what has turned out to be a wildly successful,
political organization. Yeah. Might be the most successful political organization of the last 10 years.
Exactly. Easily. So it's just like, all right, so these people were sitting around the table and, there was probably a lot of ideas. Probably, they probably brainstormed and they came up with to fund the police. And so for white folks to come swooping in and be like, no, you don't know what you're talking about. Let me bring in my marketing folks. They're going to tell you what you should be saying. It smacks of white splaining like 101, right?
It is, and it gets actually back to what we were talking about at the beginning of the show, and that is the concern trolling. Okay, concern trolling has used tone policing, whatever you want to call it, right? That has been used forever to shut down social justice movements of all time.
True.
And it's also been used to shut down secularism, right? Anytime you criticize religion, people go, oh, you can't say that. You're alienating potential allies. There's so many religious people out there.
That one drives me freaking nuts.
But this is the same thing, right? This is the same thing, right? Because basically what white people are saying is, you don't want to say defund the police because you're alienating people who are on your side, right?
Right, so
the conflict aversion, tone policing, and concern trolling are all of the same part of the same central force of so-called moderates that Martin Luther King talked about, the white moderate being
absolutely.
So this is
this is it. This is
of the white moderate, right?
Right. This is like right out of Letters from Birmingham Jail, right? The white moderate who says, I agree with your aims, but not your tactics, right? And it comes down to this whole idea of not wanting to be uncomfortable, right? Because like the whole idea of activism, it must make people feel uncomfortable.
Right. Oh.
Worked, right? And we talked about this earlier. Like he was underwater. Talk about being underwater, right? Talk about being underwater. And now, and by the way, I love this guy because he has stayed in perfect football shape for this entire time, so that at any time he could be called into the NFL, just like that. He could play right now, right?
Yes.
So I love that about him. And this guy is now, like we talked about this. He's going to be looked back on as a civil rights icon, right?
That's right.
And people don't understand that that's what people thought about MLK also.
White
America hated him.
So now all the conservatives have jumped on the bandwagon and saying, oh, MLK, we support him, but we don't support
Oh, God, I know.
But, the guy was murdered, okay? He was stopped by a white
literally murdered.
So you have that Kaepernick had to be willing to lose his career, to be vilified, to the point of losing the thing that was the most. Well, it actually wasn't the most valuable to him, because if it had been, he wouldn't have kneeled. He
wouldn't have done it. Exactly. He wouldn't have kneeled. He wouldn't have kneeled if it was that valuable to him.
So he the reason why he deserves to be a civil rights icon is because he clearly put social justice above his career, and that's
absolutely
stellar. That is stellar.
I mean, those are real heroes, right? Like we talk about heroes in our lives and all this kind of stuff, but that, like we talk about sacrifice and like the right, especially of course, loves to talk about the military and by the way, like I like for all of you out there, I am not anti-military. I'm not a pacifist, right? In fact, like the use of force is important. I respect the military and what they do. And in fact, I'm actually a student of military and military history, so I care about it a lot, especially the Vietnam War. But those folks, right? The folks that go out there and fight, like, good for them. That's important. But they're not sacrificing their careers, right? They're not sacrificing their social standing, right? like right, and that is in some ways even more difficult.
The warrior class in society has always been held in a place of honor, right? So
absolutely, and they should, and they should.
And I think also without the warrior class in society, law enforcement, right? There is no rule of law, right?
Exactly.
And you can even look at the military in a properly constituted world. If it was under the governments of the United Nations and properly handled, then militaries would also be law enforcement because you're enforcing international law, you're enforcing human rights and things like that, right? So ultimately, if we had a unitary government for the world, then all military action would be police action.
Exactly.
It would be accountable. So you can't be a pacifist and support the rule of law because without force to back the rule of law, I mean, Hobbes came up with this, a long time ago. You cannot have rule of law without the force to back it up. It just has to be
exactly. I mean, to think otherwise is to completely misunderstand, I think, human nature and misunderstand human nature in groups. I mean, you just and this is the whole Green Party with the Green Party and all that kind of stuff, right? Like, and sort of the hippy dippy type stuff, right? Like we'll just love everybody, et cetera. Like that sort of approach, right? Let's go to Burning Man or whatever, right? And they live in a commune. Right, the problem with that is exactly this: is that if there isn't, and I think Obama, for all his faults, I think he understood this, and this is why I'm okay with the drone program, right? Because he realized that look, you need to you can't just allow the world out there just to go and do what it wants to do. We have interests, right? And again, in a properly constituted military that is driven by justice, right? That is what we ought to be striving for and working toward. And I think he understood that in a way that certainly not the neocons and their sort of colonialism.
Well, Obama inherited wars. He inherited, situations of conflict that he didn't create. And so now as the president of the United States, he's required to do things that maintain, balance of power, whatever theory you're talking about in the world, you've got to you either deal with it now or you deal with a much worse problem later. And that's, I think, the calculus he was having to make in those drone strikes and everything else like that. Because back to your point about Burning Man, I mean, so Burning Man is this sort of idealistic, hippy dippy situation where everybody they're bringing their art in, they're having a good time, they're bartering, there's no money, everybody's giving everything away. But look at what Burning Man is. Burning Man is protected by a nation that's has the strongest military in the world, state police, who are there, who are actually, going around and actually, actively patrolling the site. All of that could not exist. You could not have this idealistic communal experience without the force to back it up, much as a lot of people there, hated the fact that cops were there. Imagine what would have happened if there was no force available.
Exactly. I mean, Jesus. I mean, there was a Woodstock 2. There was two, in the 90s. It was the late 90s, maybe early 2000s. There was another Woodstock, and I mean, with very few. There was two of them, and the second one devolved into absolute chaos, right? And presumably there were police there, but to some extent. But that just puts things in perspective. You can't just.
Well, and I think the classic example was Altamont, where they put the Hells Angels in charge of security, and a bunch of people got murdered. It's like
exactly. I mean, I don't remember how we got here, but I guess the rule of law question, I think we keep hitting back on this sort of rule of law. I think that's a theme that is sort of through everything we've talked about here. We could be talked about it being actively undermined undermined by the current administration, and we've actively, and openly, brazenly, undermined. We've also talked about, and in terms of, and now in terms of police brutality, right? We are also now seeing the George Floyd incident, and of course, in the ensuing protests. And the reaction of the violent reaction of the police to those protests, right? We are seeing that kind of breakdown in the rule of law. I think it's really important we talk about the police unions, right? Because they stand in the way of that, right? And gets back to the defund the police question, which is like, this is why you have to kind of start from scratch, right? Because like that's the only way to get around the police union. You look at Camden, right? Camden, New Jersey is like one of like the shining example of this.
Well, right, and so what essentially the people who unconditionally support cops, the Blue Lives Matter folks, what they're telling us is that we have two choices. We can either accept their protection with all of its corruption and flaws and protecting bad cops, or we go without. Right. So that's what they're trying to say. They're giving us this false choice where the third option, which is in the middle, which is you have accountable cops.
Right,
under political control, who are not shooting people, who are conflict de-escalating, who are referring people to social workers or drug treatment rather than arresting them, who are not going to shoot somebody in the back who's running away, all these things. That's the third option, and that's what defund the police means. I think that's what
absolutely,
because what you're defunding is the bureaucracy that has protected the cops. You're putting it back in. You're giving the power back to the city council, the mayor, to be able to actually keep these police forces in check.
Absolutely, we're talking about accountability, and we keep talking about this, right? We talk about like basic accountability, right? And one of my favorites is that conservatives rail against unions, like how corrupt they are and how they're bad for progress and this kind of stuff. But like this union is like
it's the police union.
It's a caricature of a bad union, right? Like we're talking about like this is like some Jimmy Hoffa type shit, right? Like this is the quintessential thuggish union, and of course they just have this entire pass. And again, it's because they're in like the right that they. It's a union that works for them. We talked about earlier on. We talked about the hypocrisy, right? Right. Like you hate unions unless the unions are actually like brown shirts that keep their boots on the neck of people's necks.
And this is another point to why defund the police is so important, because you could actually get into a situation where if you are the mayor or the city council and you try to challenge the police union, they may be able to put up legal roadblocks, because of agreements and contracts that were signed.
Exactly.
You have to honor this contract. You can't change the contract. You can't, we have the final say on police misconduct, right? And so
exactly.
By defunding the police, you create a new Department of Public Safety. The police union is no longer in charge of that. So you take the police department, you bring its budget down to maybe 10%. You have them writing, doing homicide investigations and, whatever things that you want cops to do. But you take that money, transfer it over into the public safety department, where a lot of these calls that really shouldn't be handled with violence are able to be handled by a social worker or a mental health professional or something. I don't know. I'm not an expert in these subjects, but I think that
absolutely. But your point is a good one, right? Because there's a really great police chief. That's almost like an oxymoron, but there's a really great police chief down in Dallas, it turns out. And black guy, interestingly, not that it's neither here nor there, but he is. I heard him talk about this, and he's a pretty progressive guy in terms of as far as police officers go. And he was talking about how one of the problems is that and this goes back to the taxes issue too, as social services have been defunded, asked the police to fill in those gaps. So homeless people on the street is the most obvious example, one of the more obvious examples, right? Because a lot of these people have mental illnesses. And I mean, actually most homeless people don't, but like the homeless people the most visible ones that you see literally on the street, right? Like these are people overwhelmingly with psychological disorders, right? So, but the point is that like, if you start actually funding those things and let police actually do what police are supposed to do, maybe you start getting less and less of the fewer and fewer of these kinds of problems. And I think you can then shrink departments, right? And you can have detectives, right, who go out and literally solve crimes, right? Maybe you get more of those people, so actually more crimes actually get solved, because they don't usually, right? And also police officers are trained like if you are trained in violence, which is they are, right? Right. That is their solution to conflict. That's how they are trained, right? Is violence. And to them, if you're a hammer nail analogy, right? Like every situation looks like a situation that should be resolved with violence. And so we shouldn't be so surprised that this is the outcome when we train these people to do that and then put them in situations that do not actually require violence, Right.
Well, and there's also a cost issue. And this is, we're getting close, I think, to the end of our I think we've been going over an hour now. But I just want to bring up one more thing about what they did in Utah. And I think there's been a couple of other conservative states that have actually found that it was cheaper to give homeless people homes than it was to pay for the public services necessary to constantly arrest them, constantly ambulances running and taking them to the hospital, the medical bills, and also the drug problems that got worse. All these things that happen with when you have destitution in your community are expensive. They're extremely expensive. So if you take some of this money from policing, which is reactive, right? And you put it into proactive programs that actually, but then you run smack dab into what you always talk about, the just world fallacy. And that's what prevents, because when people think that, well, you're always going to have the destitute, you're always going to have the poor. They're poor or destitute because they couldn't compete, and that's the way the world should be. So if you believe that, then you're only too willing to put your money into reactive programs. But if you believe that the world should be a flatter hierarchy, that there should be some sort of social justice, that everybody has a right to basic food and shelter, then you're willing to put more money into into that. And I think so. And it's just so funny how the biggest flashpoints of right left. In the past, a couple of decades have really been things like healthcare and policing. And that is because they distill down these issues of who gets what in society.
Exactly right. That's exactly right. I mean, it ends up becoming these issues of distribution, right? And it's called liberty to be able to hoard everything for yourself, right? It's just because it's called liberty or whatever. And not having to invest in your community is called liberty. Although conservatives are very, very good in their very small communities, right? They're actually usually more giving within their little tribe. But outside of that tribe.
It's about expanding the tribe. It's about, again, what I said about we have to embrace all of our citizens within the nation as part of our family. And that's really the difference between conservatives and liberals.
Exactly. And this gets back to right down to human nature, right? Like we traditionally, and I'll shut up after this, but traditionally, right, you have small hunter-gatherer bands, right? Everyone that wasn't in your band literally was not considered a human being, right? Like it was like that is how we grew up, right? That is how our brains developed. We developed in that environment. And so the key, and I believe this to my heart, is to expand that tribe so that, like you say, and that means recognizing commonalities, right? And privilege. Exactly. And religion's a big part of this too, but that's for a topic for another day.
Yeah. Well, thanks so much, Christophe. I think, let's do this again real soon.
Absolutely, man. That was a lot of fun.